notes are taken from, it's a Protestant guy who put together kind of the historical, lined up the historical and the biblical text here to understand. So, at the time when Jerusalem fell, the year was AD 70. Okay, so it's almost exactly 40 years after Jesus makes the prophecy. And remember, he said last week, this generation shall not pass away until these things take place. And so that would be, back then it would have been in everyone's minds 40 years. So it is almost exactly 40 years. So I just wanted to share some of this. But let's read Matthew 24 again as a whole. We are probably going to finish it today, but let's put it together as one big unit. So we remember this is all part of one conversation. Matthew 24 is on page 1315 in the Big Study Bible and 64 in the New Testament version of the Orthodox Study Bible. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, and will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, because lawlessness will abound, and the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. And then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been seen since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise, and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, the eagles will be gathered there also. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. And we'll stop there, because the next line is, but of that day and hour no one knows. So there's a real hard transition right there. We're going to find with today's Bible study, it's a little hard to distinguish when Christ is talking about the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 and when he's talking about the end of time, because there's a couple spots where the topic overlaps. And so we're going to try to tease that out today so we know better. But I just wanted to share with you some of these things. There was a historian, a Jewish historian, he was not a Christian, Josephus, who was there present with the Roman army when the Roman army sacked Jerusalem. And his job was to write down a history of the wars, kind of an official history. But because he was Jewish, they gave him a unique insight into what was happening, because he could understand what the people of the land and how they were dealing with the stuff. He could kind of move around freely, sort of like we might say nowadays of like a journalist. Right? Journalists will kind of embed into something and see how it really goes down. So this is most of these things are going to be from his Wars of the Jews, and there's a second book that he also included. We'll grab that every now and then. I'm forgetting offhand what the name of that book is, but there's a second place where some of this is written as well. So in the year 70 A.D., in the month of Nisan, the 15th. What's interesting about that is it's almost exactly 40 days from this, because we know Jesus is where he is because of the Passover, and it's almost Passover when they destroy Jerusalem. So when he says this generation will not pass away, I mean, he's like to the day 40 years. The national Jewish temple was surrounded by Roman armies of Titus and sacked. And interestingly, on the same date and same month that the first temple was burned down in the Old Testament in 586 BC. So Christ's, remember how we talk about how prophecies will have a double fulfillment? It's interesting that the temple's destruction, which was prophesied in the Old Testament and happened at a particular time of year, it happened again the same time of year, 500 years later. So it's these reverberations, these prophetic reverberations that keep coming up. We'll talk about some more of this, but at the time of Passover, there were 3 million people trapped in the holy city. Of these, approximately 1.1 million died terrible deaths from famine and injury, and 97,000 were taken captive and sold to work in Egyptian mines or eaten by wild beasts in Roman theaters. So going through a few of these things, it says, just to get a sense of how bad this was, this is all going to be quotes from Josephus, who was living and watching it. While the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner. Yet was this misery itself more than the disorder, for one would have thought the hill itself, which the temple stood on, seethed hot, as full of fire on every part of it, that the blood was in larger quantity than the fire, and the slain more in number than those who slew them. For the ground did nowhere appear visible for the dead bodies that lay on it. But the soldiers went over heaps of these bodies as they ran upon such as fled from them. Then in another spot, this is on book 6 of the Wars. All this burning came upon Jerusalem, a city that had been liable to so many miseries during the siege, that had it always enjoyed as much happiness from its first foundation, it would have been the envy of the world. Nor did it deserve such misfortunes as by producing such a generation of men as were the occasion of this overthrow. And so he goes on. So remember that Jesus said that not a stone would be left. This was an interesting line from Josephus. Caesar gave orders that they should demolish the entire city and temple, but for the rest of the wall, it was so thoroughly laid, even with the ground by those that dug it to the foundation. So instead of just destroying the temple, they literally dug into the ground to remove stones. And they said to leave nothing, to make those that came after believe it had never been inhabited. This is exactly what Jesus said. There will not be one stone left upon another.
Leave no stone unturned.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, literally, right?
Yeah.
Here's another. Nation shall rise against nation. Well, I'm going to skip this one because this is a little bit inside baseball here. But it turns out that while they were invading, the Romans, they would have German armies and Scythian armies and all these little things. Well, they got in a fight. So these little, what might we call them, like a platoon or something, they got in a fight themselves. So the war, nation will rise against nation on their way to this war. So it kind of halted the army from coming into Jerusalem. So there's a prophecy of that. I'm hesitant to read too much about this one story here. It's really graphic, but it might be worth mentioning. So he talked about the famine. Now this is Josephus writing. Now remember, Jesus said there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes. Now those who perished by famine in the city, the number was prodigious, and the miseries they underwent were unspeakable. For if the shadow of any kind of food did appear anywhere, a war was commenced presently, and the dearest friends fell a fighting one with another over it. Nor would men believe those dying had no food, but the robbers would search them when they were dying, lest any should have concealed food in their bosoms and counterfeited dying. Moreover, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, while they gathered such things as the most sordid animals that they would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles and shoes, and the very leather that belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed. The very wisps of old hay became food for some, and some gathered up the fibers and sold a very small weight of them for 4 Attic drachma. So, talking about everything. The story I'm hesitant to share is the story. It's a very graphic story. I'll just paraphrase, of a woman who roasted and ate her own child. It's a very famous story in this book. I hesitate because it's very graphic. He
Did you say
describes
roasted?
and ate her
Yeah,
own child.
we don't need to go,
Yeah.
because I won't get that out of,
Yeah. So, but what's important about that, and the reason why he includes it, is remember when Jesus says the tribulation is so bad, the world had never seen anything like it, and so Josephus ends up covering it from the standpoint of this is as bad as you can fathom, and he really shares again some very graphic, and the words are just too much. But then earthquakes. When the war about Actium was at its height at the beginning of the spring, the earth was shaken. It says, moreover, at the feast called Pentecost, the priests of the inner court felt a quaking. So remember what we talked about. It took a while for the armies to take their place. This is why Jesus said, as soon as you know, get out. We'll talk about that again in a second. Many will betray one another. Josephus tells the story. And here a certain old man, the father of 7 children, whose children together with their mother decided to give them leave to go out to Herod, slew them after the following manner. He ordered them to go out while he himself stood at the cave's mouth, and slew all of his sons that went out of the cave. So they were betraying one another. The abomination of desolation. This talks about in the Wars, book 6 again. Why do you trample upon dead bodies in this temple, and why do you pollute this holy house with the blood of foreigners and Jews? And if you remember, the blood of foreigners in the temple would have desecrated the temple. This is before it's totally pulled down, but you can already tell it's been desecrated. It would not have been able to be used anymore for sacrifice at this point. And then the Great Tribulation. But the entire nation was now shut up by fate as in a prison. So they laid siege to Jerusalem. And everybody who was stuck in there, remember Jesus said, as soon as you see the armies coming, you leave. He says, don't even, if you're on the rooftop, don't grab anything, leave. And the reason was because they surrounded the city, and they got word from the emperor, and they left. And this was a time that after you saw it surrounded by armies, and they left, you got to get out, because they're not going to let anyone leave. They're going to kill everything that lives, that tries to leave. And so that's what it's talking about here. Accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either man or God ever brought upon the world. This is Josephus writing. He's not even a Christian. He's not trying to make Jesus' prophecy sound more real. He's just reporting the facts. But here it almost sounds like Jesus' own words. Accordingly, it appears to me, says Josephus, that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to those of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. Also, this was interesting, false Christ and false prophets. A false prophet was the occasion of these people's destruction, which made a public proclamation in the city that very day that God commanded them to get up to the temple. Now think about that. Remember when Jesus says, if they say that I'm there, don't go try to find me. That's not the way this is going to work out. It's because a false prophet arose and told them to go to the temple. Well, Jesus has told his people, do not. That's the worst place to be during this time. So this false prophet actually led everybody to their destruction. The very day of the war, of the major battle. And then it turns out this reference, he says, if he says, so he says, if they say, look here in this inner closet, he's here, or in the desert. So it turns out there's a desert reference too. Festus sent Roman forces to fall upon those who had been seduced by an impostor who promised them deliverance and freedom if they would follow him to the wilderness. As they went out to the wilderness, the Romans killed them. So there's a false prophet, a false Christ They used a false Messiah, lured these zealots out, and then murdered them as in a false promise. Well, Jesus warned his people. Mm-hmm. If anybody says Christ is in the desert, I'm not out there. And then this one, wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered. Here is Josephus showing the fulfillment. King Herod put up a large golden eagle over the great gate of the temple. The golden eagle would have been the symbol of the Roman legion. So he took the Roman army's symbol and put it on the temple, which, again, would be the abomination of desolation. It's the emperor in the holy place, right? Of very great value, and had it dedicated to the temple. Then we have immediately after the tribulation, the sun darkened. While the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand. One would have thought the whole city was on fire. Fires across the whole country blotted out the moon at night and tinted the sun red by day. Do y'all remember when we had the Canadian fires? I don't know if it affected you all here. Mm-hmm. We were in Pennsylvania, and the sun actually looked like a burning fire in the sky. It turned the blood red. Very eerie. Well, this is what's happening to their town because they're literally lighting every inch of the city on fire. The moon will not give its light. In his book, The Antiquities, Herod deprived this Matthias of the priesthood and burnt the other Matthias who had raised the sedition with his companions alive. And that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. Right? The stars fall from heaven. There was a star, listen to this, because remember Jesus says the sign of the Son of Man. What would you think the sign of the Son of Man would probably be? Right?
Dove.
Right. Well, right. There's the Holy Spirit. What sign?
The star.
The star. The star.
Yeah.
So there was a star resembling a sword. That's the shape of a sword, a cross.
Yeah.
There was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued for a whole year. So he said the stars would fall from the heavens, and that's what it would look like. It would look like the powers of heaven are shaken. Josephus says, the Roman government in great internal disorder by the continuing changes of its rulers, and understood that every part of the habitable earth under them was in an unsettled and tottering condition. And then this one, the sign of the Son of Man in the clouds of heaven. Remember that? So these publicly declared that this signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. For, before the sunset, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about the clouds and surrounding the city. Moreover, at the feast called Pentecost, the priest of the inner court felt a quaking and heard a great noise and the sound of a multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." So they're actually seeing heavenly chariots in the skies surrounding Jerusalem. So this is all reported by a Jewish historian, not a Christian, not somebody trying to make it seem like Christ's prophecies came true, but somebody who is trying to relate simply the stories and the facts on the ground as they experience them.
How far away would he have been from watching? Like when watching?
He's in the midst of it.
But how did they keep him protected from?
He's with the soldiers, just like we do with modern journalists. He ends up, when they finally burn it and the whole thing comes undone, he's up on the hill watching it burn. But in various times he's moving around with armies and writing down. And that was normal back then because kings don't go on the war, and they want a report. How did it go? What happened? All right, so he's doing that, but he's also Jewish, so he wants to give the Jews a history of their own people. Again, Romans never had a problem with anybody, Jewish, otherwise it wasn't a race thing. If he wants to be on our side, he's on our side. But they brought it to an end. Anyway, I wanted to share that with you all just to give you a sense that, you know, when I've said this, it might be kind of controversial. Like, really, is this whole end times passage? It's actually about the fall of Jerusalem. It really is. It really, really actually is. And we're going to cover some of this again now as we go through the text. I just thought you might enjoy seeing some of that background. And I think Father Farley, this is an Orthodox source, and he has a good quote here on page 320 in this book. It says, "It happened exactly as the Lord predicted. In the days leading up to AD 70, there were indeed earthquakes and famines, and just as Jewish nationalism grew ever more intense, the persecution of Jesus' followers got even more savage. In October of 66, the Roman armies under Cestius Gallus marched against Jerusalem and surrounded her. The Christians there remembered the Lord's word and fled to the mountain city of Pella. In 70, the Romans returned under Titus. So they came, and then they left, and the Christians got out, and 3.5 years later comes the sack of Jerusalem. In 70, the Romans returned under Titus and laid siege to Zion again. The city put up a valiant struggle even though starvation reduced them to cannibalism. At last the city fell, and the temple was burned to the ground, and not one stone was left upon another. And he's corresponding that also with Eusebius' church history. So, which Eusebius was a Christian writing this history. All right. Any questions on that? Pretty wild, isn't it? Like, see a prophecy fulfilled 40 years later, just as Jesus said. Just as Jesus said it would be. The other thing that's interesting to consider is that in all likelihood, at least the first copies of Matthew's Gospel would have already been in print. Right? It would have already been in churches by that point with this prophecy sitting in it. So, anyway. So verse 23, let's go to page 1316. That's where we left off last week. Mm-hmm. Verse 23. Now, we're going to look at this. It's going to be a little hard, but you heard the whole passage today. So just remember, we're going to start to see sort of a pivot of when is he talking about the past and when is he talking about, when is he talking about our past? It's all the future from where he's standing. But where is he talking about our past, the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70? Or when is he talking about our future? There's a really clear bend point, but before that it's going to get kind of weird. All right, so here we go. Verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning flashes from east to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. Or, that's another translation. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. And then he says immediately after the tribulation. So, this little passage, if we're trying to keep our mindset, he's telling them, in the year 70, if anybody says I'm out in the desert or I'm in the inner sanctuary, I'm not. Okay, don't listen to them. Do what I told you and get out of town. But then he says, for as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. In other words, what he's saying is, when I do return, no one will miss it. Okay? You're not going to have to, if we live to see it, guys, it's not going to matter where we are. It could be in the church, we could be in a movie theater. Everybody's going to know. So he's telling them, like, don't ever listen that Christ is here, Christ is there, because believe me, when I come, there isn't going to be anybody telling anybody, because it ain't going to be a secret. That's what he means by this. So, in other words, therefore this fall of Jerusalem is not my coming. It's not the end of time. This is going to happen, and then time is going to keep going. And then he throws in this other reference, for wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. So I think the fathers, just like we're doing, they kind of have a hard time saying when the total end times quotes start happening and when the total past stuff starts happening. But right here we have this idea that in the end there's no carcass. Jesus doesn't come back. He's not dead. It's not dead people. So what he's saying is where the carcass is, there the eagles will be. In other words, this is a death. This is not the coming of the Son of Man, the living one. So it's symbolized by this eagle, as we said. Herod put the eagle of the Roman legion in the temple court. Right? So the eagles are gathered. And we've also talked about the fact that eagles don't eat dead things. So this is a reference to the Roman flags, not a reference to where the carcass is, there the vultures will be gathered. It's there the eagles will be gathered. It's a very strange phrase. And actually some translations you'll read in English, they say the vultures like correcting it. But it's not vultures, it's eagles. And it's eagles because it's the Roman army. Okay? So we'll go on a little bit further. So immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And then he goes on with the parable of the fig tree. The tribulation here refers back to verse 21. So this is confusing. Immediately after 70 AD, is the sun and the moon darkened? Well, we did see actually it was, physically, because of the fire. But it's also interesting. Join me in Acts 2. Because there's a symbolism happening here as well. Not just the physical darkening of the sun and moon, which we already heard about, but we might even be shocked at how people in the Bible interpreted the Bible. So in Acts chapter 2, on page 1472, we have Pentecost. Okay, and if you remember, the other apostles receive the Holy Spirit and they start speaking in tongues. Mm-hmm. I'll share with you what I think happens here. The fathers have different things, but if you put it all together, here's what I think happens. 11 of them stand up and they're speaking the various languages of the people who are gathered there for the Feast of Pentecost. So one guy's, like in our world, they're speaking Arabic, and another guy's speaking French, because there are people from Gaul there, and it's another guy, okay? So each guy is saying the same words in different languages, and as it happens, they don't know those languages. But now that they've got all these nations, they don't all speak Hebrew, they don't all speak Aramaic, which would have been the street language, they don't all speak Greek. So they're speaking to each one of them in their own language, saying the same words. And then Peter stands up to explain to the Jewish people what's happening. Okay? So he stands up and he says, and I'm going to just quote from verse 16, it's down on the bottom left of the Big Study Bible. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. And it came, and now this is the quote from Joel. And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out of my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your young men shall see visions, your old man shall dream dreams, and on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. So far so good, but now listen. I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whosoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know, him being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death. Okay? So he is specifically taking this passage and saying it's fulfilled today, but then he says, the sun and the moon, right? The sun will be darkened and the moon turned into blood. When did that happen? On Pentecost. It doesn't even say that in the passage. So how does he get that conclusion? The reason he gets that conclusion is he's using that symbolically. Remember when God made the sun and the moon in Genesis 1, he says he made the sun to govern the day and the moon to govern the night, and then the stars of heaven. And the idea was that they were governors, and they were symbols of governors, of kings. Okay, they were symbols of governors and kings. And so if you wanted to explain in the Old Testament, symbolically, if you wanted to say that a nation was going to fall, you might say a star fell from heaven. Okay, because one of the kings of the earth was cast down. Or the sun and the moon, this is the big, right? This is the big stuff. Remember in the Old Testament, we had Joseph, and he said, the stars and the moon bowed down to me. Remember that? Joseph. Well, he doesn't mean literally the moon would worship Joseph, although, interestingly, is a symbol of Christ, and that does kind of happen. But he's trying to use this parallel that his parents, the Jewish original fathers of the Jewish people, would bow down to him. So moon and sun and stars is symbolic of governors and important powers. Okay? So now we can kind of understand what he means by on Pentecost that this has happened. Because what he's actually saying is this Jesus you crucified has become king of the universe. All the rulers have been cast out. He's it. And that's what actually happens, because now it turns out Jerusalem is not more important than the nations. The gospel's going to go everywhere. You see what he means? So he's actually using it totally symbolically, because the moon isn't turned to blood on the day of Pentecost. That doesn't happen literally, like the moon doesn't like start dripping or something. It means something. And it goes back to Genesis. And this is true. If we have time, it would be really cool to do a Bible study through the prophets. But it's all through the prophets. Isaiah 13, Ezekiel 32, and Joel 2 all refer to the fall of a nation as the sun darkening, the moon turning to blood or darkening or falling, or stars falling from the sky. But of course we also saw in Josephus, it also was literal apparently. We saw a comet, for instance. A comet's not a star, but it would look like a star. Right? So that's kind of helpful. So this is important for sharing with people. If you meet people who are kind of into end time stuff, is to be able to go to Joel 2 and say, well, wait a minute now. Joel 2 makes it very clear that the moon turned to blood at Pentecost. I mean, he says it. This is fulfilled in your hearing. Like, this is fulfilled today. Joel 2. So that's a really good way of saying, if you're thinking that at some point in the end of time, the moon is literally going to drip blood, you are not being biblical about your understanding. Because that's not, Peter can't be wrong about the fulfillment of Pentecost. He's St. Peter. If Peter's wrong, we're all wrong. Right? Yeah.
So you're saying that the blood and the darkness refers to the Pentecost.
Mm-hmm. Because he says that.
Because he says that. Could that also be referring a bit back to the crucifixion?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
About the blood of Jesus and how everything went dark at that time when he, right?
Correct.
So okay.
Correct. Yes. He's playing on that concept. But it's not that the moon literally
Right.
turned to blood.
Exactly.
Or even if you weren't living in Jerusalem, it probably wasn't dark all over the earth. It was probably just local to
Right.
that area.
Okay.
But we don't have to be like, as biblical people, we don't have to be trying to bend the scriptures to be like,
So literal?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, because they weren't used that way. St. Peter's obviously not using them that way. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's on his mind. Yeah. All right. But he's trying, so in that moment, he's just trying to tell the Jewish people, is like, this is it. This is what Joel told us about. So we don't need to be scared. We don't need to be upset about this. We just need to accept that this is happening in our own day, and we need to do what Joel told us to do. Right? Follow the Messiah in this case. Repent, actually, is what Joel told them. Okay, so we continue on. Where were we? Oh, okay, so then we continue on through this. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. We talked about that in the old way, the way that that Josephus talked about it. And it says, then he will send his angels with the sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So what is that referring to? Well, remember, angels is not always a species, the things we think of with wings that fly around and are invisible. Angel is also just the word for messenger. So this idea is that at the point when this destruction happens, God is going to call all of his people from all over the world to follow the message of the gospel, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, Acts makes this really, really clear, and maybe our next Bible study could be through Acts, because we could probably go through it pretty quick. But Acts makes it very clear that the destruction of Jerusalem, the persecution specifically in Jerusalem, is actually what forces the gospel to go out to the nations. Because at first the apostles are all kind of stuck in town. They kind of don't know what to do. And then the Holy Spirit comes, and they start to kind of fan out a little bit. But it isn't until the persecutions that forces all the apostles out of the Holy Land. And they start to travel further. Remember, Paul is the one that starts really going elsewhere because he's not one of them, right? So that's also helpful to kind of understand that the fall of Jerusalem will really be the catalyst for the Christian faith pouring out in what we might say sort of fever pitch at that point. They're going to the apostles spread the gospel anyway, but we really see the church expand during that destruction, because all of these Jewish Christians who knew Jesus will now go and live somewhere else, not able to stay in their own land. Okay, so now the next section. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away. Again, remember we talked about heaven and earth, this ruler's concept. That the world will come unglued, but my word, it will not change. No matter what you see, I'm not wrong. Hang in there, right? But my words will by no means pass away. Now notice what we're saying here. This is so important for us. This generation shall not pass away until all these things take place. Just to be very clear, this is why we as Orthodox Christians believe this is referring to the past. Otherwise, he's not right. Right? This generation shall not pass away. Okay, so these people living, some of them at least, are going to see these things happen. Well, up to this point, we've pretty much said they did. That happened in 70 AD. Most of the apostles would have lived to the year 70 if they hadn't been killed first. And then some of the apostles literally will live that long. St. John, for instance, living 20 more years after the fall of Jerusalem. Okay? All right, so now let's go on. But of that day and hour, okay, now we're turning the page. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Do you hear? Did you hear the big switch? He's kind of been somewhat overlapping. When I come, it'll be this. Don't worry about it, because this isn't that. Now he's very clear. But of that day, that one you asked me about at the beginning of the passage, remember he said, they said, tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? 2 questions. So I answer the first question. Let's answer the second question. Of that day and hour, no one knows. Only the Father. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days of the flood, okay, so what were the days of the flood like? Let's see. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Okay, so let's just talk about this, because we kind of hit this last week, but this is even more clear. What are the signs of the end of time according to this passage? According to this passage, people will be eating and drinking. They'll be marrying. Those don't sound much like,
The end time.
doesn't sound like anything. Sounds like a normal day.
Normal day.
That's the sign of the end.
Great.
Yeah.
So
In other words, you don't know.
Yeah.
Life is going on. It seems like Jesus isn't coming back. He said all this stuff. Now he's in heaven. And we're all still here. And Jerusalem is destroyed. And we're all still here. And life is going to go on. And you're going to start to think, wow, this is all pretty normal. He says, and wasn't that what happened with Noah? Nobody suspected it. I mean, he told them, the Bible says actually that he preached to them, but they didn't believe him.
They didn't believe him.
But because, of course, that sounds ridiculous, right? Sounds ridiculous to us. Life's going on, Noah. Don't know what your problem is. You're acting like the end of the world's tomorrow. Noah's like, it actually is tomorrow, but right? So it's going to be just like that, he says. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. All right. So let's pick up my notes here.
But if you were in the Middle East right now, you would think that this was the end of the world.
Yeah, because it
really
resembles
sounds like that.
because it resembles the first section of this passage, doesn't it?
Yes,
The
it
stuff
does.
we said already
This
happened.
is creepy.
So why does it sound
Well,
like
not
something that happened a long time ago is happening again? Remember what the Bible's taught us this. Because that's what happens. The Bible shows us patterns of the way God makes the world. So just like their world came unglued and the end of time came on them, the end of time is kind of every generation in different places. The fall of nations looks this way. But Jesus is very clear. None of that will be a sign of my coming. Nation will rise against nation, famines and pestilences and wars, but that's not a sign of my coming. So don't look over at a war and say, well, now I think Jesus is coming. He specifically says, don't do that. Right? If anybody tells you, here I am, I'm not. All right. So yes, you're right. And I think that that's the way we should understand the scriptures, as these patterns. And we should see the end of the world happen when Rome fell, for instance. Many Christians at the time Rome fell said this is the end of time. And in a way it was the end of a time. It wasn't the end of all time, but it was an end of something very important. When Byzantium fell, so when the Eastern Empire, Roman Empire fell, if you read the stories of the Christians living at that time, they write it like the end of the world happened to them. Because it did. In a little, we would say like in a little cosmic moment. But the literal end of time didn't happen to them. Okay? So we don't have to look at this passage and just be, just write it off completely into the past and say, well, that'll never happen again. Well, it does happen again. But we also don't want to misread it and say, well, now there's wars and rumors of wars and pestilences and think Jesus is coming back. Because Jesus is specifically telling you the sign of my coming is the day going to be normal. It's going to be the same as it's always been. You're not going to be able to look and see. He just got done saying, hey, you guys know, I didn't even mention the fig tree. He says, with the fig tree, when it starts to sprout, summer's coming. Because apparently the deal with the fig tree in this part of the world is it's the last blooming tree. It blooms right before summer. So it signifies the end of spring. So he uses the fig tree to sort of say, you'll know the end is coming when you see the fig tree sprout. But of that day and hour, no one knows. You see what I'm saying? He's like, yeah, you'll know when Jerusalem's going to fall because everything I just said is going to happen. You're not going to know when I'm showing back up. And this to me is very important because what it basically does for Orthodox Christians is we can't look at the world out our windows or at the television and say, I'm in the end times. Or if you want to say it the way a Christian would have said it throughout history, we should be able to look at any day of the year and say, I'm in the end times. I'm living at the last moment is the Christian mindset. Not because I have some sign that Jesus is going to come back, but because I have to live like it. I have to live like Jesus is coming to get me today. I have to live like Jesus is coming to get me this minute. But there will not be a sign. I'm not going to walk out one day and be like, oh, I got to get my life together. You with me? And Jesus says explicitly why, too. Because he says that if the devil knew when I was coming, he'd get ready. Right? It's like, I'm not doing none of that. I'm not giving the enemy an upper hand. I'm not telling y'all, I'm not telling anybody the sign of my coming. Actually, he says no one knows. But right? But that was the little parable there at the end.
So, no element of surprise, which again, what you just said was about the devil not getting the upper hand.
Yeah.
And then for us, we are not going to, let's see, we're going to be trying to be a good Christian every day and not try to hurry up and change our ways at that sign. So it's
Correct.
trying to get consistency, like you said, living every day as if it were our last.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's
all right.
it, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, Jesus is saying, don't, like, I'm not coming for you soon. And you're going to think everything just went back to normal. And it's going to stay like that a long, long time. But you, my people, you need to live like I could come back any second. Because in actual truth, you can.
I
And
think
then,
I
of
am
course,
living that way right now.
right, and then I was going to
Everything
say,
aside.
and of course, the flip side of that is by death, it can actually be our end of time,
Mhm.
any minute.
Right.
So Jesus's instructions are actually super helpful way to live a Christian life. Period. Even if you happen to live in some time was very, very peaceful for 100 years or whatever, you can still live like my death is any minute, or Christ could come back any second, and that creates a saint because you're always ready to give an account, always ready for judgment day to drop. And of course, we would be perfect if we actually lived that way, wouldn't we? Yeah, you wouldn't want to make any mistakes, you know. Okay, so let's get a little deeper into this text because this is a classic text that if you're familiar with the rapture theology, this is one of the passages about the rapture. So I want to share this with everybody to sort of help us to understand why the Orthodox Church never believed in the rapture, but why some people do. So here it is in verse 40. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and the other left. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. We'll stop right there for a second. So the idea of the rapture theology, if you're familiar with end times theology in America, there's this idea that when Jesus comes back before the end, he's going to take all the Christians and they're going to go up into heaven, and then the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket because there's no Christians left to season the salt the earth. And the Antichrist will rise up and persecute the world for 7 years. And then Christ's final coming will be after that 7-year tribulation. The 7 years comes from another passage. Okay, but that's the doctrine. But when we look at this passage, I just want to point out a couple things about this passage, and I'll talk about another one because I want you guys to be equipped to have a Bible conversation if you had to about this subject. The 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. Now remember, this is as in the days of Noah. So I want to go back to that passage. I want you to notice something. They did not know, this is verse 39, and they did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. So if we say this again, I just want us to say, 2 men will be in the field. So two farmers. One will be taken, the other left. Now, the rapture theology says the person taken is the one taken up to Jesus, and the other one is left behind.
Mm-hmm.
But did you notice in verse 39, it's the reverse. The flood took them away. Noah and his family are left on the earth. Is the opposite of the rapture theology. So the idea is actually, in the end times, when Jesus does come, 2 farmers will be working in the field. One will be left for the new heavens and the new earth, and another will be excluded from the new heavens and the new earth. They'll be taken away from heaven, you would say. Taken away from that moment. The taken are the ones who are condemned, according in the time of Noah. So unless he's just not noticing what he said, and this is the Lord, I have to think he knows what he's saying. It's not one will be taken and the other left on earth for some hell to occur, which is very, very, by the way, Gnostic. The idea that God would just give the earth over to the evil people. The earth, the whole Old Testament was the earth's going to belong to the righteous. Didn't Jesus say in the Beatitudes? Right? For you shall inherit the earth.
Right.
So the idea here is the reverse. The people who are left get to keep the earth. The people who are taken are those who are taken out of the earth. They're removed from the inheritance. It's actually the reverse of the rapture theology.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I've always been confused by this, because God created the heavens and the earth. God created everything on earth. Why would he leave it?
Correct.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Correct.
I've
And
never
unfortunately,
understood why
I did never either.
the bad shall inherit.
Yeah, the bad shall inherit the earth is sort of
that
the
God
idea.
made.
Yeah.
It makes no sense.
No, it
It
makes
doesn't make sense, right?
yeah, right. It's you know,
Who's
it's like
right about something?
yeah, exactly. So it ends up it's the
Also
reverse.
confusing.
The meek shall inherit the earth,
Yes.
and those who are excluded, they're taken, they're removed from it. Right? That's the image that we should see here. Especially because Jesus explicitly says it. It says the flood came and took them. Then he says one will be taken, the other left. So the taken have to be the people taken in the flood, not the people who are. Right. Anyway.
Father?
Yeah.
So back just a bit. So Jesus does not want to give the devil any notice.
Yeah.
So if the devil did have notice, what would we have expected to happen?
Well, that's a
What would
good
the devil
question.
do?
I mean, his argument here, we could just look at what he says. He would have taken care that his house not be broken into. So I think the idea is that he feels that, that if there were signs or whatever, that the devil would use that to, entrench people in their sin. Which actually, oddly enough, now that I even think about it, this is a really good question, so I'm thinking about it on the fly. It's interesting because that is what would happen if he gave us signs. So for instance, if let's just imagine that Jesus gave us a sign like a plant you've never known will grow up in the desert of Egypt. And all of a sudden one day the plant sprouts. Well, some people might be like, okay, I need to start taking my life seriously. But until that plant sprouts, everybody's going to live like the devil. Right? And then it sprouts. And then people start getting. Well, then let's imagine it takes it 20 years to get to the size Jesus wants it to. So the first year, we're all real serious. The second year, it's like this tone. We're like, yeah, I don't know. And the third year, it's like, come on now. So then you start to live like the devil again. Because it's like, oh, he ain't coming. I mean, he ain't coming back anytime soon. So I think that might be a little bit of what he's talking about is I don't want to give a sign because the devil will use that to his benefit to bring people to condemnation through looking for some sort of event that will cue them, sort of like in our life, right? That, well, if I get cancer, then I'm going to take my life seriously. I'm going to take my spiritual life seriously. Well, we're not assured that we're going to have, I mean, not that any of us want to battle with cancer, but we're not all going to get 9 months of warning. Some of us just won't wake up in the morning, and that'll be the end of the story. So we're supposed to live our lives that way, and not just wait for a bad illness to kind
So
of.
it goes back to that same theme.
Yeah, I'll get my life together when I get sick. I'll get my life together when
Okay.
because, gosh, we're all like that, aren't we? It is nice. It is nice that God does give us little warnings, like, hey, you might want to take your life a little more seriously here. It is nice that we get those little warnings, but we all know that the actual final one we may not get a warning.
Mhm.
It might just be lights out or lights on, as the case may be. Yeah.
Speaking about the whole, like, giving a sign for the end of all time, right? Like,
Yeah.
I was just thinking of, like, the other side of it, of the temptation almost immediately of, oh no, the world's ending, I should go get all my stuff.
Yeah.
Or like, oh, I'm gonna eat a lot of cheeseburgers. Or,
Yeah.
oh, I've never stole from a bank before, maybe I should try that out before the world. I don't know, but like,
No,
randomly.
it is interesting that among like real like groups that get caught up in end time stuff, it does present some very unusual things like that, committing crimes, of course, you know, famously like giving up everything and moving to a commune and drinking Kool-Aid, like.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or you look at people. I don't know why this came into my mind, but if y'all are familiar with what the rapper Sean Diddy Combs is going through,
Oh yeah.
I mean, everybody put him on a pedestal.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because he's a gazillionaire with a lot of power. And then all of a sudden, and he lived this horrid, private life that, I mean, beyond disgusting, what he did to people. And now that he's caught, oh, just let me live at home with an ankle bracelet. I promise I won't do anything. Hello?
Yep.
You know, you've got planes, you can do this. Everybody tries to, like, change everything but when they've been given everything, they become so self-important, so self-indulgent.
Yep.
And they can manipulate everybody around them. It's like really they are the devil right in front of you.
Yeah.
And you see it over and over and over. All these people with all this money and all this power and all this influence, how they manipulate.
It is interesting that when you really take the Bible and you try to apply it internally and to the world that you're experiencing, you do find out these principles are alive in
All day, every
like
day.
that, like the idea of, well, right now I can live for the moment and this and that, like somehow I'm going to be able to navigate it. No, it'll eat you alive. It'll turn you into a demon.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can't live like that. Sin doesn't want you to have a little bit of a good time. It wants to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
It just offers you, it's like a mousetrap. It's offering you really nice tasting cheese, but you ain't gonna get the cheese.
You see it right now, like with
Devil wants you dead.
sports betting. So I know that I have like a slight issue with gambling.
Mm-hmm.
So I know never to gamble. Fine. I turn, because I love football. And every time I watch football all day, every day, because politics is going to kill me. So it's NFL, praise Jesus. I can't turn on my phone without all these betting
Yes.
sites.
Oh man, I've
And
been
what
thinking
it
about
is
this a lot.
doing to college students. So now, all these college students, these kids, because you can bet over the phone, they have destroyed their lives. So now, it's like the beer commercials. They've got all this stuff, all of these like warning, or cigarette,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
if you
Half the
think you
screen's
have
now a warning.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you think and there's several that are targeted to college students. I'm like, holy guacamole.
Yeah.
But, so if you know you have a problem, but you still have a little cash on your credit card,
Yeah.
you give me 50, I'll give you 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's
gambling
just
is
constant.
gambling's an interesting
I
one.
get those too because I play games.
Yeah.
All the
Yes.
advertisements are.
Oh,
Oh,
it's
yeah. Yeah,
constant.
like
Solitaire.
solitaire. Yeah.
Solitaire.
Solitaire
They're
game.
all
I thought,
Yeah,
oh,
you
people
can buy
now-
a mini mansion in Ottawa Hills by playing solitary.
I think
don't
the
think
same
so.
thing, Corinne. It's they're destroying their lives.
It
Yeah,
is.
It's wild. Did
It
you have a
is.
question, Patty?
Yeah, so Father, if we live with this normalcy and being normal, because again, no surprise, no signs, do you feel that Jesus is better able to tell who might be a true Christian versus someone who at the last minute says, oh, there's a sign, I better turn?
Oh, no, actually, so just to say this, I think God honors both. I mean,
All
Saint
right.
Saint John Chrysostom's Paschal homily says that, right?
Yeah.
That even at the 11th hour,
11th hour, right.
yeah, he
right.
honors the intention. It's like,
Okay.
but what he's telling us here, though, is we should be very thankful when we're given a warning. We should be very thankful when we're giving a warning. But he is saying very clearly, but don't expect one. So I think what he's saying, I think the problem is that we're so given over to the idea of like getting the best reward for the least amount of work.
Okay, yes.
That if he was like, guys, I'm coming back at 11:30 a.m. on this date, at 11 that day, we'd still be like, oh, you want to go grab a cheeseburger? Like,
11:25.
yeah, yeah, it's
Let's, okay, 11:29, let's pray.
Let's do
yeah,
it.
yeah, exactly.
So,
Because he really gets the next paragraph. He
But-
really nails it down.
that's really annoying though.
I know.
Because let's say I have these philosophical conversations all the time on Sundays when Charles was coming home from his side church and he's got an hour and a half to drive. And I was having this, like, on the 11th hour.
Yep.
But let's say you are some serial killer or a pedophile and you know your number is up because you're on death row.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got the death penalty, and you know when they're gonna,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden you find Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay, You're walking down the hall and you find
Mm.
Jesus, and all of a sudden you're repentant.
Right.
Really?
Well,
I mean, I know that's above my pay grade.
yeah, I was
but
gonna say 'cause
really?
Jesus knows the truth.
Yeah.
Like if you're just using them as an insurance policy, my thinking's gonna be you're gonna get up there, you're just gonna,
Okay.
you know.
But if
I mean, I'm
let's
not,
say-
but if it's genuine, because we do also have to acknowledge how many of us, and I mean, I even count myself this way, is like, just because one time in my life I had this little bitty scare of like a bad possible health diagnosis,
Mhm.
and it shook me really deeply, and I thought to myself, well, how am I living that this would do this? Why am I thinking like this? So the point is like it's in all of us
Yeah.
to sort of pull the last minute card. And I think it's a good warning we shouldn't try that. But if we do it genuinely, God will forgive us. But if we don't do it genuinely and we
Yeah.
just use them as a fire insurance policy, I kind of have a feeling it's not going to make much difference. And the reason is because our judgment is actually our conscience. And it's actually the truth of what's true in us is exposed. That we're all the fakeness that we've put in our life, it's all removed. So we are exposed to ourselves, even to who we really are. And so I would say that a person who tries to use Jesus as fire insurance, and we're just talking about that person, right? I'm not saying that person is that person. I just mean a person
Yes.
that does do that. Dying and saying Jesus forgive me is not going to be equivalent to actually getting it. And there's another thing that we haven't talked about a whole lot in here, but we can talk about it at some point. And it's the idea that repentance actually, we need to be able to do something to heal from it.
Mhm.
So for instance, a murderer can actually take action to change his will, for instance, and give it to the families of those that he hurt, or whatever. I'm just thinking of something. If we don't do that, then we carry that with us into Judgment Day. The fact that we haven't made things right. So we also should never just have this idea that we can have cheap forgiveness. You know, I'm a pretty easygoing father in confession. I think anybody who's gone to me for confession knows I'm pretty easygoing in confession. But it is my responsibility to make sure that if somebody does something to someone, that something's done to rectify that. And it doesn't necessarily just be an apology. Sometimes it's very explicit, like go and put two of those things back in their place or whatever it is. Right? So it isn't as simple. Even that isn't as simple as, sorry, Jesus.
Yeah.
Bzz, you know, it would have to be genuine, and it would also be attendant with some sort of action, some sort of reciprocating action that shows.
Mhm.
You know, maybe even as simple as saying at the chair, it's like, I'm only now realizing what I've done, and looking at the families, I'm so sorry. I've never until this moment, as he gets ready to die now, what he did to this other person, he killed them. Not ever thinking about them. Now he is thinking of maybe he can have some sincere moment, but something's going to have to happen. He can't just be like, well, that, you know, because it's, remember with Judas, it's regret, not repentance.
Mhm.
He regrets it, but he's not repentant. If he was repentant, Jesus would have received him. Just Peter betrayed him too,
Mhm.
right?
That explains it well, because we're touching on the same kind of things. And then I'm suspecting at times we humans think we can hide things or trick other people, or, you know, we can show this kind of a exterior being, but and I guess we have to realize obviously that Jesus is pretty smart, God's
Yeah.
pretty wisdom filled, and would know the difference.
Absolutely. There's
Right.
no facade.
Right. I mean, he knows the little hairs on our head and about all the birds. I
He
mean,
sees
so there's
the
no
soul.
exactly. So
Right.
there's no. So maybe people think sometimes last minute they can trick him, perhaps,
Yeah,
with
maybe.
that false fire.
Yeah, fire insurance.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but we know that's not true, and that's
Right.
one of the reasons why confession is such an important part of our lives, because it's in confession that we try to be as honest a human
Mhm.
being as we can be. And I think there's a reason for that. Is that's how we'll be on the last day. we will be exposed for everything we are. We need to get used to it and acclimate ourselves to a heavenly life. And that's there should be something in this life that resembles that. Well, confession is. You take off the mask and you take off the, use the heavenly callus remover and like come in with nothing but who I really am. Lord, I'm a mess, and here I am. Well, let's finish this passage because it's going to drive this home, and then we'll end it because I've run over. But I feel bad if we don't read this next passage because it really proves what we've just said. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Assuredly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, now notice this, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and to eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he is not looking for him, and at an hour that he is not aware of, and he will cut him in two, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. See that? That's, in other words, when he goes to summarize, he says exactly what we just said. Right? He's like a good servant. He says, a faithful and wise servant whom his master made ruler over his household, that's us, to give food in due season. Blessed is the servant whom he finds doing that. Blessed is the servant who's going out and feeding the hungry. Right? Giving drink to the thirsty. Giving giving clothing to the naked. Blessed are you if you're doing these things. But then he's got this really weird turn. He says that my master is delaying his coming. He starts doing this. It says he cuts him in two. I thought, hey. And I thought, well, that's a strange thing. So I started looking it up in the Fathers. Like, why cut in two?
Not like a magician.
No, yeah. He cuts him in two and then gives him a portion with the hypocrites. I'm thinking, well, you cut him in half. So I don't know what portion he gets. You know what it is? It's exactly what we were just saying. A hypocrite's two-faced. He splits him apart. He splits him from his mask. That's actually what the Fathers say about that passage. Isn't that cool? So he's saying that at the end, he'll say, "Oh, I'm your servant, Lord," but he goes around beating people and drinking and eating with drunkards. He cuts him in half, and then he gives him his portion with the hypocrites because he's a hypocrite. He's two-faced. Anyway, thought that was pretty cool. And then he says, "There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So we're back to that phrase. Do y'all remember what weeping and gnashing? It's regret. It's missing out. It's what's that?
Like the murmur.
Yeah. Right? Like, I could have had it. I was this close. Like, yeah. It's not, yeah. That's hell. Hell is, I was invited to the heavenly meal, and now it's all been laid out before everybody, and there's no seat for me because I excluded myself. I have no portion at the table. I don't know about you. I'll be happy to get the last seat at that table, right? But you don't want to not get a seat, and especially when you know you were invited, right? Or maybe the equivalent might be like a meal, and you're really excited, and maybe I don't know, but your favorite NFL star or something shows up to that dinner and you missed it. I don't know. I'm trying to think. It's like, no, you're kidding me. I had tickets for that. Right? That regret, but with anger and weeping and gnashing of teeth. This idea of all the good things that were promised in Christ were true, and I took them for granted, and now I'm sitting outside while everyone else gets to eat forever, because that's what heaven is, communion forever.
It just, part of what boggles, well, I'm just too thick-headed to get it. And I don't know if I'm ever going to get it, is Christ knows how humans are, God knows. He made us. And he's talking about don't fall for the horrible side of the human condition. And I know we all wish that Christ would just make us, be like a helicopter parent and just make everybody good.
Yeah.
And there's always this these horrid wars. And, you know, we as humans, we've been saying forever and ever, never forget, never forget, never forget. Well, we're watching genocide right now. Does anybody care what's going on in the Sudan? No, because they're poor and black. We don't care. We sit here and we talk about all this stuff. We watch this stuff over and over and over and over and over again, and it never changes.
Mhm.
And no matter, and it's just, you pray, and Islam seems to be growing at a exponential rate. Christianity has been hijacked by a bunch of false prophets. All these other, it's just, you look at, you know, even parts of the Catholic Church where it's become so liberal, you go, are you sure you're still part of the Catholic Church?
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that the Orthodox are perfect, but we're close.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, it doesn't seem like it gets better. I know there are more good people than evil, which is why we're always surprised by evil.
Mhm.
And it always hurts our heart and makes us cry and want to help. But since the beginning of time, even, it never changes.
Yeah. Well,
And it's depressing.
it is
It
depressing,
is.
and I think partly because we don't have God's eye view of it. You know, a huge part of our difficulty as human beings is we don't trust God to be good at His job, and so we just kind of think he's kind of bad at this. But actually, I think if we had His vision, we would understand His goal. But I think one of the things to keep in mind that seems to be God's thing, because it was even the way He began very small.
Mm-hmm.
You know, He could have showed up, I mean, not theory, lightning flash and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but He doesn't. He comes as a baby, and very few people know about Him, and then
Mm-hmm.
it grows and grows. And this is the idea that the destiny that He's created for each of us is so profound. To be able to be a part of God, to be able to be part of the family of the eternal God, that it's worth it apparently for Him to put up with all the tomfoolery that we've done ever since, to just gain one little saint. And I think that that should give us a sign that trying to become a saint is worth it at a cosmic level. Like God's willing to risk it to gain one little holy person, two little holy people, three little holy people, that it must be extraordinary to be a part of that and to be called to that. So you're right, it does seem like things are off the rails, but remember in the New Testament, it makes me think maybe we should spend some time studying the end times part of the Bible, the way that the Orthodox have understood it throughout history, because it's actually more like what you just described. How do we live in a world where everything is on fire? What does God want us to do in a world that doesn't make any sense anymore? Because as a Christian, it doesn't make any sense anymore.
Right. Right.
You know, but that's the early church. That's how it was for them too. That's how it was for them. That's what Revelation's actually about. It's not about the end time so you know what's going to happen. It's about how do you live in a world that makes no sense? Why do we live in a world that makes no sense? And what are we supposed to do in a world that makes no sense until you, Lord, decide you're done and you wrap the thing up? And it turns out that's the Christian life. It's actually living in the face of nonsense, the very meaning of the word, no sense at all, and to bring meaning and to bring life and to bring a shining lamp to a dark place that people can find their way out of it while it's still fizzling out, as it were.
I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah, it's a very different approach, but it helps us to understand why did our forefathers, you know, like why the Slavic countries, you know, create the Greeks. I could pick anybody. Why were their whole cultures transformed by Christianity? Like their whole culture. Like how you went to someone's house had a Christian ritual. Why? Because of their understanding of the end times, not our understanding, which is like it's all going to end and we got to get out of here really, really quick. Their mindset was, we are heaven in the midst of darkness. And you do that, and then they accidentally, as it were, took over the Roman Empire. Well, we didn't expect this. Like, we
Right.
kind of thought y'all were going to kill us all, but now we're ruling the place.
Right.
Yeah. So I think in the same way, that was the mindset. It was, how do we live amidst an unclean generation? And then in time, what happened was, like leaven, it worked its way through a lump, and the whole dough of Greece went from pagandom to Christianity, without anybody really thinking that was possible. But that was their mindset, because they see this end time stuff as real. It's like my life, defined by my life. Instead of like we do, it's sort of like wringing of hands more. So we can maybe we'll do that. I'll look at our options for the next study, because we're almost done. 25, 26, 27, and 28. So then we'll go over, maybe we could do Revelation and back, walk back some of the other end time stuff that's in other places. Would that be all right?
Mhm.
Sorry, I ran way over, but
Well, I
It's
asked the
okay.
wrong
Because we ask
question.
questions.
yeah. O Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. Glory to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and to the ages of ages.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.